The invisible prison nobody talks about. Think about the last time someone asked you why you didn't come to the party. Or why you seemed quiet. Or why you made a particular decision. Now think about your answer. Did you give one, quickly, instinctively, before you even had a second to breathe? Most people do. And most people never stop to ask themselves, why? Because here's what nobody tells you. The moment you open your mouth to explain yourself to someone who did not genuinely ask, not out of curiosity, but out of pressure, judgment, or entitlement, you have already lost something. Something quiet. Something you can't quite name. But over years and decades of doing it, the loss compounds until one day you wake up and realize you don't actually know who you are anymore. You only know who you have been performing yourself to be. This video is not about becoming cold. It's not about building walls or becoming the person who walks out of rooms without a word and thinks that makes them interesting. That's a different trap entirely. This is about something far more honest and far more difficult. It's about understanding why the compulsion to justify yourself exists in the first place, where it was born, what it costs you every single day, and what becomes possible when you finally, slowly, learn to let it go. We're going to go deep today. Not surface-level affirmations. Not a list of tips. We're going to trace this habit all the way back to its psychological roots, and Carl Jung, one of the most penetrating minds in the history of human psychology, gave us the framework to understand it with a kind of clarity that is almost uncomfortable. Because the truth is, this pattern, this constant explaining, justifying, apologizing for your own existence, is not a personality trait. It is a wound. And wounds, unlike traits, can heal. But healing begins with understanding. So let's start at the very beginning. Not your beginning as an adult. Your beginning as a child, because that is where this all started, long before you had the language to recognize it. Part 1, the wound that started it all. Emotional invalidation in childhood. There is a moment, and most people can find it if they look honestly enough, when they first learned that their feelings were a problem. Maybe you came home from school one day furious about something that happened. A teacher embarrassed you in front of the class. A friend betrayed you. Something that felt enormous and real and urgent. And the adult in the room looked at you and said, "You're being too sensitive." Or, "That's not a big deal." Or the worst one, the one said with complete indifference, "Stop overreacting." In that moment, something shifted inside you. Not dramatically. Not all at once. But a quiet belief was planted: what I feel on the inside does not match what is acceptable on the outside. My inner world is too much. It needs to be edited before I share it. This is what psychologists call emotional invalidation. And Carl Jung spent decades studying what happens to people who grow up in environments where their inner experience is repeatedly dismissed, minimized, or punished. His conclusion was stark. When a child's emotions are consistently invalidated, they do not simply move on. They internalize a devastating belief: I am not trustworthy. My own feelings are not reliable. I need external confirmation before I can know what is real. Think about what that means in practice. A child who is told they are being dramatic for crying stops trusting their own tears. A child who is told they have no reason to be afraid stops trusting their fear. A child who is told their anger is disrespectful stops trusting their sense of injustice. They learn, slowly and thoroughly, to override their internal signals and look outward, to the faces of authority figures, to understand what they should be feeling. And then they grow up. They become adults. But the internal wiring doesn't automatically update just because the calendar changes. The grown person still carries that child inside them, the one who learned that their experience needs to be approved before it has the right to exist. And so they explain. Constantly. Compulsively. Not because they are being considerate or communicative, but because somewhere deep in their nervous system, they are still waiting for someone to tell them, yes, it's okay. You're allowed to feel that. You're allowed to be that. Jung called this the loss of internal authority. And it is one of the most quietly devastating things that can happen to a person. Because without internal authority, without the ability to trust your own experience as valid, you become psychologically dependent on the external world. Other people's reactions become your compass. Other people's approval becomes your permission slip. And other people's confusion or disapproval becomes a kind of emergency that needs to be resolved immediately. This is why people who explain themselves constantly feel such physical anxiety when someone seems upset with them. It is not just social discomfort. It is something older and deeper, the terror of the child who learned that when others are displeased, something is wrong with me. Something must be fixed. Something must be explained until the discomfort goes away. Here's the difficult part: this coping mechanism was brilliant when you were 8 years old. Explaining yourself, appeasing, adjusting, these were survival strategies in an environment where you had no power. You could not leave. You could not set boundaries. The only tool you had was your words and your willingness to make others comfortable with you. But you are not 8 years old anymore. And continuing to use the survival strategies of a powerless child when you are a fully grown adult is not just unnecessary, it is actively self-destructive. Because every time you explain yourself to someone who does not deserve that vulnerability, you are reinforcing the old belief that your existence requires external permission. You are training your own nervous system to stay small. And the cost of staying small, over years, over decades, is enormous. Let's talk about what it actually takes from you. Part 2, the daily cost, how compulsive self-explanation erodes who you are. It doesn't happen in one dramatic moment. That's what makes it so difficult to recognize and so easy to ignore. It happens in Tuesday afternoon conversations. In the pause before you send a text. In the way you preface an opinion with "I might be wrong, but." In the way you say "No, I totally understand" when you don't understand at all and you're hurt. In the way you laugh at a joke you find offensive because saying something feels like more trouble than it's worth. Jung identified this pattern as a form of what he called ego self-alienation. The ego, he explained, is meant to be the functional center of consciousness, the part of you that navigates daily life. But when the ego becomes primarily organized around external approval, it stops being a navigator and becomes a performer. And the self, the deeper, authentic core of who you are, begins to be buried under layers of performance. Let's make this concrete. Think about a conversation you had recently where you felt one thing but said another. Where you were frustrated but expressed patience. Where you were exhausted but said you were fine. Where you disagreed strongly but softened your position until it barely resembled your actual view. You may have told yourself this was maturity. Tact. Emotional intelligence. Sometimes it is. Context matters. There are absolutely situations where choosing not to express something fully is a wise and deliberate choice. The difference between wisdom and self-betrayal is intention. Wisdom says, I am choosing to hold this because the timing is wrong or the relationship doesn't warrant it. Self-betrayal says, I am hiding this because I am afraid of what will happen if I don't. The problem is that most people who live in the habit of compulsive self-explanation have lost the ability to tell the difference. They are not making a conscious choice. They are reacting from an automatic, deeply conditioned fear. And that fear is running their life. Here is what that costs you over time. First, it costs you clarity. When you constantly adjust what you say based on how you anticipate others will receive it, you eventually lose access to your own unfiltered thoughts. You start thinking in pre-edited form. You stop even knowing what you actually feel before you've already begun translating it into something more palatable. Secondly, it costs you energy. The sheer mental labor of monitoring other people's reactions, calculating what to reveal and what to conceal, adjusting your words in real time, this is exhausting in a way that is hard to articulate but deeply felt. Many people who struggle with chronic fatigue, persistent low-level anxiety, or a vague sense of joylessness are, at least in part, exhausted by the constant performance of a self that is slightly different from their actual self. Third, and this is the one Jung emphasized most, it costs you your psychological integrity. When what you feel, what you think, and what you say are consistently different things, you create a fracture inside yourself. And that fracture, sustained over time, produces exactly the symptoms Jung associate with neurosis: a nameless inner emptiness, difficulty making decisions, persistent self-doubt, the feeling that you don't quite know who you are or what you want. Because how could you know what you want? You've spent so long focusing on what others want from you. There's also a social cost that most people don't anticipate. The compulsive explainer, the person who justifies everything, who is always available to be understood, who bends themselves into new shapes to accommodate others' reactions, often believes this makes them likable. And sometimes, in the short term, it does. People who never push back, never disappoint, never create discomfort are often described as so easy to be around. But here is what actually happens beneath the surface. People don't respect what they don't have to earn. When you make yourself endlessly accessible, endlessly pliable, endlessly explainable, you make yourself easy to take for granted. Not out of malice, but out of human psychology. We value what requires something from us. We trust what holds its shape under pressure. And the person who is always reshaping themselves to fit the expectations of the room is, on a subconscious level, communicating, "I don't quite trust myself." And it is very difficult to trust someone who doesn't trust themselves. This is the paradox at the heart of compulsive self-explanation. The very behavior designed to make you accepted and understood is the behavior that, over time, undermines the quality of your connections. Because authentic connection, the kind that actually sustains people, is built on knowing who someone really is. And you cannot be known if you are always in the process of editing yourself. So the question becomes, what is the alternative? If explaining yourself is a wound, what does the healing look like? If self-betrayal is the disease, what is the cure? Jung's answer was not a technique. It was a process. He called it individuation, and it begins with the construction of something most people have never been taught to build: internal authority. Part 3, Internal Authority, what it actually means to trust yourself. The phrase, trust yourself, has been so thoroughly recycled by self-help culture that it has become almost meaningless. So let's strip it down to something real. Internal authority, in Jungian terms, is not confidence in the conventional sense. It is not the absence of doubt. It is not certainty. Internal authority is the capacity to validate your own experience without requiring external confirmation before you allow it to be real. Let that sit for a moment. It means that when you feel hurt, you do not need someone else to agree that you should feel hurt before you are permitted to feel it. When you feel uncomfortable in a situation, you do not need to build a logical argument for your discomfort before you are allowed to act on it. When you know something is wrong for you, you do not need to convince anyone else of that wrongness before you trust your own knowing. This sounds simple. In practice, it is revolutionary. Because for people who grew up in environments of emotional invalidation, and that is a far larger percentage of the population than most people realize, the idea that your own inner experience is the primary authority on your own inner experience feels foreign. Arrogant, even. There is a deep-seated belief that subjectivity requires corroboration. That feelings need evidence. That you cannot simply say, "I know this is true for me," and let that be enough. Jung traced this to what he called the persona, the social mask we develop to navigate the world. Every person develops a persona. It is not inherently problematic. The issue arises when the persona becomes so dominant, so rigid, so heavily invested in managing others' impressions, that the person behind the mask loses contact with who they actually are. At that point, the mask stops being a tool and becomes a cage. Building internal authority means, gradually and deliberately, loosening the mask. Not removing it entirely, That's not the goal and not realistic. But creating enough space between who you perform yourself to be and who you actually are that you can hear your own signal through the noise. How does this happen in practice? It starts with something that seems almost absurdly small, noticing the impulse to explain before you act on it. That half-second between the moment someone looks at you with expectation and the moment your mouth opens. In that gap, which most people spend in a state of automatic anxiety, there is actually space. Space to ask, do I need to explain this? Would my explanation be an authentic offering of context, or would it be an act of appeasement? The distinction matters enormously. Authentic communication is generous, it shares yourself with another person. Compulsive self-explanation is defensive, it tries to manage another person's reaction to you. The first comes from wholeness. The second comes from fear. And most people, if they are honest, know the difference in their body. There is a quality to the compulsive explanation, a tightness in the chest, a kind of rushing quality in the words, a need to see the other person's expression soften before you can stop, that is qualitatively different from choosing to share something true. Developing internal authority also requires something that sounds paradoxical, becoming comfortable with being misunderstood. This is genuinely difficult. The fear of being misunderstood is, for many people, one of the deepest fears they carry. It touches on something primal, the need to be seen clearly, to be known accurately, to exist coherently in another person's perception. But here is what Jung understood and what most people have to learn through painful experience: you cannot control how others perceive you. You can explain until your voice gives out and still be misunderstood. You can justify until the argument is airtight and still be judged. Understanding this fully, not just intellectually but emotionally, in your bones, is one of the great liberating realizations of adult psychological development. Because once you genuinely accept that being misunderstood is a permanent feature of being a complex person in relationship with other complex people, the compulsive need to explain yourself begins to lose its grip. You stop trying to resolve the unresolvable. And you start putting that energy somewhere more useful, into actually living according to what you know to be true. Jung described individuation, the process of becoming psychologically whole, as requiring what he called traversing the desert of inner solitude. This is not a comfortable metaphor. The desert of inner solitude is the experience of standing in your own truth without the company of others' approval. It is saying no without the comfort of being understood. It is making a decision that others question and not rushing to resolve their confusion. It is being at peace with the silence that falls when you stop explaining, even when that silence feels loud and uncomfortable and makes you want to fill it. This is not coldness. It is not cruelty. It is not indifference to others. It is the refusal to place your self-worth in other people's hands. And that refusal is, paradoxically, one of the most generous things you can offer to your relationships, because when you stop needing people to validate your existence, you can finally relate to them freely, as an equal, without the distorting pull of your own need. Because here's what's interesting about people who have genuinely developed internal authority. They don't use it as a weapon. They don't withhold explanation out of arrogance or as a power move. When they share generously and honestly. And that difference, subtle as it sounds, changes absolutely everything about how a person moves through the world. It changes how they are perceived. It changes the quality of their relationships. And it changes something inside them, the quiet, ongoing sense of whether they are at home in themselves or perpetually displaced by others' expectations. Part 4, The Power of Silence. What happens to your relationships when you stop? The moment you begin to genuinely shift, when you start letting some moments pass without explanation, when you start letting people sit with their own discomfort rather than rushing to resolve it for them, you will immediately notice something. Not everyone likes it. Some people will like it very much. And the line between those two groups will tell you more about the health of your relationships than years of comfortable conversation ever could. Silence, the kind that comes not from avoidance but from security, is profoundly revealing. It functions like a diagnostic. Because the people who become destabilized when you stop explaining yourself are, almost universally, the people whose relationship with you was built, at least in part, on your instability. This sounds harsh. It is worth unpacking carefully. Some relationships are built on genuine mutual respect and affection. In these relationships, when you stop over-explaining, the other person adjusts naturally. They don't interpret your silence as aggression or withdrawal. They accept that you are a person with your own inner life that is not always available for narration. These relationships become deeper and more honest when you stop performing yourself in them. But other relationships, and many people have more of these than they realize, are built, at least partially, on a power dynamic. Not necessarily a malicious one. Power dynamics can exist without either party being consciously aware of them. But when one person consistently explains, justifies, and adjusts in order to manage the other person's reactions, a pattern is established. The explainer is the one who does the emotional labor of maintaining the connection. The other person comes to expect this, and often does not even notice they are being served. When the explainer stops, when they begin to simply exist in the relationship without the constant supply of justifications and appeasements, the dynamic is disrupted. And disrupted dynamics reveal their true nature. The person who is being unconsciously served by your insecurity will often react in ways that feel like criticism or withdrawal. They may become cooler. They may escalate. They may accuse you of being different or difficult, and they will not be entirely wrong. You are different. You are no longer playing the same role. This is one of the most painful parts of the process. Not because the other person is necessarily a villain, most aren't, but because losing a dynamic, even an unhealthy one, involves genuine grief. You have to let go of a version of the relationship, and possibly the relationship itself, as you step into a more honest version of yourself. Jung was very clear on this. The process of individuation, of becoming truly oneself, frequently involves the dissolution of relationships that were built around a false self. This is not something to celebrate cheaply. It is a real loss. But it is a necessary one. Because you cannot grow into wholeness while simultaneously maintaining relationships that require you to stay fragmented. What happens on the other side, though, is genuinely worth the difficulty. When you begin to occupy space without apology, when your presence is simply your presence, not a negotiation, you begin to attract a different quality of connection. People who relate to the real version of you, rather than the managed version, tend to offer something different. They are not threatened by your boundaries. They do not require constant emotional labor from you. They bring themselves to the relationship in the same honest way you are now showing up. These connections feel different. They feel easier, in the deep sense, not the superficial ease of a relationship where everything is smoothed over, but the ease of genuine alignment. Where you don't have to remember what version of yourself you presented last time. Where you don't have to calculate how much to share. Where you can simply be, and that is enough. There is something else that happens when you stop explaining yourself, something that is harder to describe but very real. Your relationship with your own emotions changes. Because one of the hidden functions of compulsive self-explanation is that it keeps you in your head. The moment you feel something, discomfort, grief, anger, longing, the habit kicks in. Let me analyze this, let me articulate it, let me make it presentable, let me explain it to someone who will help me make sense of it. When you interrupt that habit, you are forced to do something most people find genuinely uncomfortable, actually feel the feeling. Without immediately narrating it. Without converting it into language and handing it to someone else for processing. Just feeling it, inside your own body, until it does whatever it does. This is terrifying for people who have used explanation as a form of emotional avoidance, which, it turns out, is a large number of people. But it is also where genuine healing happens. Because emotions that are felt fully tend to move. Emotions that are explained away, rationalized, and handed off to others tend to persist. The feeling you spend 10 minutes explaining to a friend dissipates less than the feeling you spend 10 minutes simply allowing to exist inside you. External silence creates the conditions for internal listening. And internal listening is where you start to actually know yourself, perhaps for the first time. Part 5, Psychological Integrity, Becoming the person who no longer negotiates their essence. We need to talk about what it actually feels like to arrive somewhere. Not as a permanent destination, psychological growth is never really that, but as a new orientation. A different way of standing in relation to yourself and the world. Jung used the word individuation to describe this, the ongoing process of becoming more fully yourself. And at the heart of that process is what we might call psychological integrity. Not moral integrity, though that often develops alongside it. Psychological integrity, the state of being internally coherent. Of having what you feel, what you think, and what you do in reasonable alignment with each other. People with high psychological integrity are not perfect. They are not always certain. They doubt, they question, they change their minds. But there is a through line in them, a consistency of self that persists across contexts. They do not become a fundamentally different person depending on who is in the room. They do not abandon their sense of what is true for them because someone in authority disagrees. They do not shrink their feelings to a size more convenient for others. They live, as much as humanly possible, from the inside out. What is striking, and this is the thing Jung kept returning to, is that this quality is felt by others before it is understood by them. There is something about a psychologically integrated person that commands a quality of attention you cannot manufacture. It is not charisma in the conventional sense. It is not forcefulness or bravado. It is something quieter and more substantial. It is the felt sense, in the presence of such a person, that they are not performing. That they are simply there. This quality is magnetic precisely because it is so rare. Most of us spend most of our social lives in some degree of performance. We are all, to varying degrees, wearing versions of ourselves calibrated for the room. When you encounter someone who isn't, someone who seems genuinely, unhurriedly at home in themselves, it is almost disorienting. And deeply attractive. Because something in us recognizes, even if we can't name it, what wholeness looks like. So how do you get there? Not through a revelation. Not through a single decision. Through practice. Through the accumulation of small moments where you choose your own truth over the comfort of approval. Here is what that looks like in the concrete texture of an ordinary life. It looks like saying, very simply and without elaboration, that doesn't work for me, and then being quiet. Not filling the silence that follows. Not adding layers of justification to soften the rejection. Just letting the statement stand. It looks like leaving a conversation without explaining why you need to leave. It looks like changing your mind without apologizing for the inconsistency. It looks like disagreeing with someone who expects agreement, not by arguing, but by saying clearly, I see it differently, and then not debating the point unless you genuinely want to. It looks like feeling embarrassed and not explaining yourself out of the embarrassment. It looks like being in a bad mood and not feeling obligated to provide a narrative of why. It looks like showing up imperfectly, late, unprepared, less than your best, without the compulsive post-mortem of self-justification. None of this is easy. Every one of those moments will be accompanied, initially, by the familiar wave of anxiety. The voice that says, they're going to think badly of you. They're going to be upset. You need to say something. Explain. Make it right. Learning to feel that anxiety and not obey it, to recognize it as an old signal that no longer accurately reflects your situation, is the work. And it is real work. It is the kind that happens not in a single insight but in the repeated practice of choosing yourself, quietly, in small moments, over and over. Over time, something shifts. The anxiety around unexplained silences decreases. Not because you've become indifferent to others, but because you've developed a more stable sense of your own reality. You no longer need the external confirmation to know that what you feel is real. Your own experience becomes sufficient evidence of itself. That is internal authority, finally in place. And here is what becomes possible when it is. Your relationships, the ones that survive and the new ones that form, reach a different level of honesty. You stop resenting people for receiving the edited version of you and then not fully knowing you, because you are no longer giving them the edited version. The energy that was spent managing perceptions becomes available for actual living, actual creating, actual presence with the people and experiences that matter to you. Your sense of time changes. People who live in a habit of compulsive self-explanation are often, in a very real sense, living in the past and the future simultaneously, replaying old justifications, preloading new ones, managing the narrative across time. When you stop, you become more present. Not perfectly, but noticeably. There is more of you available for the actual moment you are in. And perhaps most fundamentally, your self-concept stabilizes. You stop defining yourself by how others respond to you. You develop, slowly and imperfectly, a sense of who you are that does not collapse every time someone is displeased or confused by you. You become, in the truest sense, your own ground. Jung believed that this process, this long, difficult, entirely worth it journey toward individuation, is not a luxury for the psychologically curious. He believed it was a moral imperative. That the person who refuses to do this inner work does not only harm themselves. They harm everyone around them, because they are operating from a false center, making choices driven by unconscious fear rather than genuine values, relating to others through a persona rather than a self. The world has enough people operating from fear. Enough people explaining themselves into shapelessness. Enough people living at the mercy of others' expectations. What it needs, what every relationship and community and family and institution benefits from, is people who have done enough of their own work to know who they are. People who are not a different person depending on who is watching. People who can offer genuine presence rather than careful performance. That work begins exactly where this conversation ends. With a recognition. With an honest look at where you are explaining yourself out of fear rather than out of genuine desire to share. With a moment, perhaps a small one, where you let the explanation sit unspoken, and you sit with whatever arises in the silence. Because in that silence, there is information. There is you, underneath the habit. Waiting, perhaps for the first time in a very long time, to be listened to. Not by someone else. By yourself.